The November fog of 1889 had descended upon London with a persistence that seemed almost malevolent, transforming the familiar streets into a labyrinth of amber halos and muffled sounds. From our sitting room at 21B Baker Street, the gas lamps below appeared as dim sentinels struggling against the encroaching gloom, their light barely penetrating the thick, yellow shroud that had settled over the metropolis like a burial cloth. I had returned from my rounds in Paddington to find Sherlock Holmes in one of his contemplative moods, seated in his chair with his long, thin fingers steepled beneath his chin. The fire crackled warmly in the grate, casting dancing shadows against the book-lined walls, yet there was a restlessness about my companion that spoke of a mind hungry for stimulation. For 3 days, London's criminal classes had provided nothing worthy of his remarkable faculties, and I could see the familiar signs of that dangerous ennui that sometimes possessed him. "The fog has its advantages, Watson," Holmes observed without turning his head as I entered, shaking the moisture from my overcoat. "It conceals much from the casual observer, yet to the trained eye it reveals even more. The clay on your left boot, for instance, is of the distinctive reddish variety found only in the Bayswater district, deposited there no more than 2 hours ago. You've attended to Mrs. Pemberton's rheumatism again, I perceive, and stopped at Harrod's on your return. The distinctive wrapping paper is visible in your coat pocket." I had long since ceased to marvel at such demonstrations, though they never failed to bring a smile to my lips. "Quite right, as usual, Holmes. Though I confess I wish you might apply that magnificent brain to something more substantial than cataloguing my afternoon movements." "Patience, my dear fellow," Holmes replied, rising from his chair with that sudden energy that marked the transition from languor to action. "Unless I'm very much mistaken, substance approaches even now. Listen, do you hear it?" Through the fog-muffled sounds of the street below, I detected the urgent clatter of hooves on cobblestones, growing rapidly nearer. A moment later, a hansom cab pulled up before our door with such haste that the horse's breath steamed in great clouds, and the driver's voice could be heard shouting directions through the murk. "A client at this hour?" I asked, glancing at the clock, which showed nearly 10:30. "Desperation, Watson, keeps no regular hours," Holmes replied, moving to the window. "Observe the manner of arrival, hasty, urgent, yet the passenger hesitates before alighting. He fears what lies behind him more than he fears disturbing us at this late hour." Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stairs preceded her announcement by several moments, and when she appeared at our door, her face bore that mixture of concern and curiosity that invariably accompanied the arrival of a new case. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, slightly breathless. "There's a gentleman here to see you, a Mr. Edmund Whitmore. He seems most distressed and says the matter cannot wait until morning." Holmes was already moving toward the door. "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, you might wish to put aside your evening paper. I believe we are about to receive something worthy of our attention." The man who entered our sitting room was perhaps 45 years of age, well dressed in evening clothes of obvious quality, yet his appearance spoke of profound agitation. His dark hair was disheveled despite the evident care with which it had been arranged earlier in the evening. His white tie hung askew, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched his top hat. Most telling of all were his eyes. They held the haunted look of a man who had witnessed something that challenged his very understanding of the natural world. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I have come to you because Scotland Yard has proven utterly inadequate to the situation, and I fear that without your intervention, a terrible injustice will be done. My name is Edmund Whitmore, and I believe my business partner has been murdered under circumstances so extraordinary that Inspector Lestrade has declared the case impossible to solve." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own. "Please, Mr. Whitmore, compose yourself and tell us everything. Watson, perhaps some brandy for our guest." As I poured a measure of spirits, our visitor sank into the offered chair, pressing his hands to his temples. When he looked up, his eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. 2 nights ago, he began, accepting the brandy with a grateful nod. My partner, Mr. Reginald Ashford, was found dead in the locked study of his house in Grosvenor Square. The circumstances, Mr. Holmes, are utterly inexplicable. The room was sealed from within, the key still in the lock, the windows latched tight. There were no marks of violence upon his body, no signs of poison that the physician could detect, yet he was most certainly dead. But it is what the police discovered beside his body that has them baffled and has brought me to your door in desperation. Proceed, Holmes said, settling back into his chair with that alert intensity I knew so well. There was a candle burning on the desk beside him, Mr. Holmes, an ordinary beeswax candle in a brass holder. According to the constable who discovered the body, it had been burning for at least 6 hours, based on how much wax had melted away. Yet Ashford had been dead for no more than 2 hours when he was found. The physician was quite certain of this based on the body's temperature and other factors. I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. You're saying the candle continued to burn for 4 hours after his death? That is exactly what I'm saying, Dr. Watson. But that is not the strangest part. Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. When the police examined the scene more carefully, they found that the candle had burned in a most peculiar manner. Instead of melting evenly, as wax normally does, it had formed a perfect spiral as it consumed itself, a mathematical spiral, as precise as if it had been calculated by an engineer. Holmes leaned forward sharply. A spiral? Describe it exactly, if you please. The constable sketched it for the report, Whitmore said, reaching into his coat pocket. I managed to obtain a copy. He handed Holmes a folded paper. Holmes examined the sketch with intense concentration, his gray eyes moving rapidly across the page. After a moment, he looked up with that peculiar expression that indicated his mind was already several steps ahead of the conversation. This is no random pattern, he murmured. This follows a precise mathematical progression, what the learned men call a logarithmic spiral. Watson, do you recall your geometry? The ratio of the radius to the angle remains constant as the spiral expands. But surely, I protested, a candle cannot burn in such a pattern naturally. Precisely the point, my dear fellow, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming, which suggests that either the laws of physics have been suspended in Grosvenor Square, or we are dealing with a human intelligence of considerable ingenuity. He turned back to Whitmore. Tell me, what was your partner's business? What manner of man was he? Ashford was a financier, Mr. Holmes. We dealt primarily in government bonds and railway investments. He was a methodical man, perhaps even obsessive in his attention to detail. He had been working late that evening on some complex calculations related to a new investment opportunity, something involving Indian railway bonds. The papers were found scattered about his desk, some bearing scorch marks from the candle's proximity. Were these papers of particular importance? Whitmore hesitated. There had been irregularities in some of our recent transactions. Nothing criminal, you understand. But Ashford had discovered discrepancies that troubled him greatly. He had been working to resolve them when he died. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing. Mr. Whitmore, I must ask you directly. Do you believe your partner was murdered? I do, Mr. Holmes. But by whom and how, I cannot fathom. The locked room, the impossible candle, the mathematical precision of its burning, it seems like something from a Gothic novel rather than real life. Yet here we are, dealing with the very real consequences, Holmes observed. When did you last see Mr. Ashford alive? Yesterday afternoon at our offices in the city. He seemed troubled, distracted. He mentioned that he had an appointment that evening. Someone was coming to his house to discuss the irregularities I mentioned. He did not say who. Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly. An appointment, yet the house was found locked from within. Exactly, Mr. Holmes. Either his visitor never arrived or— Whitmore's voice trailed off. Or the visitor possessed the ability to vanish into thin air. Holmes finished grimly. "Tell me, have you brought this mathematical spiral to the attention of Inspector Lestrade?" "I have, but he dismissed it as coincidence. He believes Ashford died of natural causes, perhaps a heart attack brought on by his financial worries, and that the candle's behavior, however odd, has no bearing on the matter." Holmes smiled that thin, cold smile that I had learned to associate with his most challenging cases. Inspector Lestrade has always possessed a remarkable talent for overlooking the extraordinary in favor of the mundane. Fortunately, Watson and I suffer from no such limitation. He turned to me with eyes bright with intellectual excitement. "My dear fellow, I believe we have encountered something that will test every faculty we possess. A locked room, an impossible candle, and a mathematical mystery that defies conventional explanation." "You'll take the case, then?" Whitmore asked, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since his arrival. "Indeed I will, Mr. Whitmore. More than that, Watson and I will examine this locked study tonight. I find that mysteries have a way of revealing their secrets more readily in the dark hours when London sleeps, and the fog provides a curtain against prying eyes." As our client departed to make arrangements, I turned to Holmes with curiosity. "You seem remarkably animated by this case, Holmes. Is it the locked room that intrigues you, or this business of the mathematical spiral?" Holmes paused in his preparations, his pipe halfway to his lips. "Both, Watson, and neither. What intrigues me is the fundamental impossibility of the situation as presented. A man dies alone in a sealed room, yet a candle burns beside him with mathematical precision for hours after his death. It suggests either a supernatural explanation, which I reject entirely, or a human mind of extraordinary cunning, one that understands not only the principles of deception, but the very mathematics of combustion itself." He lit his pipe and allowed the smoke to curl upward toward the ceiling. "There is something else that troubles me about Mr. Whitmore's account. The scorch marks on the papers, Watson. If Ashford had been working at his desk for hours, as the candle's consumption suggests, why would he allow important financial documents to remain so close to the flame that they became damaged? It speaks either of a man so distracted by his work that he ignored obvious danger, or what, Holmes? Or a scene carefully arranged by someone who understood the importance of every detail save one, that a living man would never allow his crucial papers to be scorched by carelessness." As I packed my medical bag and a few necessities, I could not shake the feeling that we were about to embark upon one of the most perplexing cases of our long partnership. A locked room, a mathematical mystery, and a candle that burned with impossible precision. It was a puzzle that seemed to bridge the gap between the rational world of criminal investigation and something far more sinister. The clock struck 11 as we descended the stairs to meet Mr. Whitmore's waiting carriage. London's fog pressed close around us, muffling the sounds of the city and lending an air of unreality to our departure. As we rattled through the darkened streets toward Grosvenor Square, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his fingers drumming against his knee in that rhythmic pattern I recognized as deep concentration. "Watson," he said at last, as the imposing facades of Grosvenor Square emerged from the fog like the ghosts of Georgian grandeur. "Before this case is concluded, I suspect we shall discover that the impossible and the inevitable are often separated by nothing more than human ingenuity and a thorough understanding of natural law. The candle that wouldn't go out may prove to be the key that unlocks not just this mystery, but the very nature of deception itself." His words, spoken with such quiet certainty in the darkness of that carriage, would prove more prophetic than either of us could have imagined as we approached the house where mathematics and murder had conspired to create a puzzle worthy of the greatest detective mind of our age. The Whitmore carriage drew to a halt before number 47 Grosvenor Square, its wheels crunching against the frost-hardened cobblestones. Through the swirling fog, the imposing Georgian facade loomed like a monument to respectability, its tall windows dark save for the faint glow of gaslight filtering through drawn curtains. A constable stood guard at the entrance, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter November air as he stamped his feet against the cold. "Evening, gentlemen," the officer said, straightening at our approach. "Constable Bradshaw, sir. Inspector Lestrade left word that Mr. Whitmore might return with assistance." His tone suggested Lestrade had been less than complimentary in his description of amateur involvement. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson," Whitmore introduced us. "They have my full authorization to examine the study." Recognition flickered in Bradshaw's eyes, followed by grudging respect. "Mr. Holmes, sir, heard of your work. I was first on scene with my sergeant when we broke down the door." "Excellent," Holmes said briskly. "But before you describe what you found, Constable, I wish to observe the scene with fresh eyes. Preconceptions are the enemy of accurate deduction." We followed Whitmore through the marble entrance hall, past portraits of stern ancestors whose painted gazes seemed to follow our progress. The house possessed that peculiar stillness of recent death, as though the very walls held their breath. The study lay at the rear of the ground floor, its heavy oak door standing open to reveal a room of considerable comfort and masculine authority. Holmes paused at the threshold, his keen eyes sweeping methodically across every surface. For a full minute he remained motionless, absorbing details with that extraordinary faculty of observation I had witnessed countless times, yet never ceased to admire. The room was handsomely appointed with mahogany bookshelves, reaching to the ceiling, heavy burgundy curtains, and a large desk that dominated the center space. "The key, Constable," Holmes said without turning. "Its exact position when you arrived." "In the lock, sir, turned from the inside. Had to push it out with wire to use our own key after forcing the door." Holmes finally stepped into the room, moving with characteristic precision. He knelt beside the carpet, producing his magnifying lens to examine the fibers with minute attention. Rising gracefully, he moved to the windows, testing the latches and inspecting the frames for any sign of tampering. "All secure," he murmured. "Watson, observe our impossible candle." I approached the desk carefully, mindful not to disturb the scene. The brass candle holder stood near the center, containing what remained of a beeswax candle that had burned down to perhaps 2 inches. But it was the pattern of melted wax that commanded attention, a perfect spiral formation that defied every natural law of combustion I understood. The wax had not dripped randomly, but had formed successive curved ridges, each positioned with mathematical precision. Holmes bent close, his lens flashing in the gaslight. "Remarkable, Watson. Pure beeswax of the finest quality, expensive and slow burning. Note how the spiral maintains consistent proportions, each curve precisely related to the last. This is not the chaotic melting of ordinary combustion, but the controlled flow of deliberate design." He straightened, examining the scattered papers on the desk surface. Several bore brown scorch marks along their edges, yet the marks appeared oddly uniform, as though maintained at a constant distance from the flame. "The body was found slumped in this chair?" Holmes asked, indicating the leather seat behind the desk. "Yes, sir," Bradshaw confirmed. "Head resting on his arms, peaceful-like. No signs of violence, no struggle. Physician said his heart simply stopped." Holmes's eyebrows arched slightly. "His heart chose to cease functioning at precisely the moment when a candle burned in a mathematically impossible pattern. Extraordinary timing, would you not agree?" He lifted the brass holder, examining its base with his lens. "Watson, this inscription, Tempus Fugit, time flies. Rather appropriate, considering our mystery." He replaced the holder carefully. "This candle, gentlemen, is no mere source of illumination. It is a precision instrument, a timepiece designed to measure specific intervals with mathematical accuracy." "A timepiece?" I asked, fascinated despite the grim circumstances. "Indeed. The spiral formation could only result from controlled combustion, the wax flow regulated to create this precise pattern. Someone has converted an ordinary candle into a sophisticated timing mechanism. Holmes's eyes gleamed with intellectual excitement. The question remains, what was being measured and for whose benefit? Before we can understand Mr. Ashford's death, we must first comprehend the purpose of this remarkable chronometer. His words hung in the air like the lingering smoke from the impossible candle, promising revelations that would challenge our understanding of both murder and mathematics. Holmes turned from the desk and began his methodical circuit of the room, his sharp gaze traveling from ceiling cornice to skirting board with the same tireless precision he had once devoted to chemical analysis. The study revealed its secrets reluctantly, each detail requiring careful extraction from the accumulated evidence of ordinary life and extraordinary death. Dropping to one knee beside the hearth, Holmes sifted a pinch of ash between his thin fingers, lifting it to his nostrils with practiced delicacy. "Two kinds of tobacco here, Watson," he murmured. "The constable's coarse shag and something far more refined, a delicate Turkish blend favored by our deceased host." He extracted a small charred fragment of paper from the grate with his forceps. "Most interesting. Heavy bond paper, expensive quality, with traces of distinctive royal blue ink. Not the sort used for casual correspondence." Rising gracefully, Holmes moved to examine the door's inner mechanism, studying the keyhole and surrounding brass with his lens. "Observe, Watson, the wear pattern on this escutcheon. The heaviest polish lies slightly below and to the left of center. The habitual reach of Mr. Ashford's own hand when locking the door from within. No external tampering here." His attention returned to the scattered papers on the desk, and he lifted one bearing those peculiar scorch marks to the gaslight. "These burn patterns are far too uniform to be accidental, Watson. They form a perfect arc, suggesting these documents were held at a fixed distance from the flame for a sustained period. Yet observe, the scorching is superficial, darkening the edges without destroying the text. If destruction were the aim, why not burn them completely?" "Perhaps to create an impression," I suggested, "to establish that these papers were present during the candle's long burning." "Precisely, my dear fellow. Someone wished us to believe these documents were here throughout the candle's impossible vigil." Holmes knelt beside the desk, his lens focused on the carpet beneath. "Now this is most instructive. Watson, observe these wax drippings." I joined him on the floor, noting several pale droplets scattered across the burgundy fibers. "They're not directly beneath the holder," I observed. "Indeed, some lie nearly 18 inches from the desk edge. This candle was moved during its burning, yet we are told the room remained locked. Ashford was found dead at his desk, and no one else was present. How then did our mathematical timepiece relocate itself?" Holmes rose and moved to the bookshelves, his fingers trailing along the leather spines. "Ashford's reading habits prove illuminating," he said, extracting a slim volume. "The Mathematics of Combustion and Flame Propagation by Professor Heinrich Müller. Rather specialized knowledge for a financier, would you not agree, Mr. Whitmore?" Our client's face registered genuine surprise. I had no idea Reginald possessed such interests. He never mentioned them in our partnership. "Men often harbor passions they do not advertise," Holmes observed, replacing the volume, "particularly when those passions serve purposes beyond mere intellectual curiosity." He turned to Constable Bradshaw with sudden intensity. "This appointment Ashford mentioned. The visitor coming to discuss financial irregularities. Was any correspondence found regarding this meeting?" "No letters of that nature were discovered, Mr. Holmes. Only the business documents you see there." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "How convenient. A mysterious appointment, an unnamed visitor, and the invitation itself has vanished. Either Ashford disposed of it elsewhere, or someone possessed the remarkable ability to remove evidence from a locked room." He paused, his gaze sweeping the study once more. "We have before us a locked chamber, an impossible candle, deliberately scorched papers, missing correspondence, and a dead man whose heart simply ceased functioning. Each element appears disconnected, yet I am convinced they form a coherent pattern, a pattern as precise and deliberate as that mathematical spiral in the wax. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock, its steady rhythm seeming to mock the temporal impossibility we faced. Holmes stood motionless in the center of the room, his mind clearly racing ahead of our observations, seeking the hidden logic that would transform this collection of impossibilities into inevitable truth. Holmes closed his notebook with a decisive snap and turned to face our small assembly with that penetrating gaze I had learned to associate with the moment when scattered observations began to coalesce into meaningful patterns. The study had yielded its immediate secrets, yet I could see in his expression that these revelations had only deepened the central mystery rather than resolving it. "Mr. Whitmore," Holmes began, his voice carrying a note of quiet authority, "I fear you have been less than entirely forthcoming regarding the nature of these financial irregularities. The precision of that mathematical spiral suggests we are dealing with someone possessed of both advanced scientific knowledge and intimate familiarity with your business affairs. I must therefore insist upon complete candor, however uncomfortable the truth may prove." Whitmore's composure, already strained by the evening's events, began to show visible cracks. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man unburdening himself of a long-carried secret. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. The irregularities Ashford discovered were more serious than I initially indicated. Over the past 18 months, approximately £8,000 entrusted to our firm for investment in Indian Railway bonds had been temporarily redirected to other ventures. The funds were always replaced before any client audit, and indeed, our alternative investments often proved more profitable than the original bonds. Yet Ashford had become increasingly troubled by what he termed our ethical flexibility. Holmes's eyebrows arched slightly. "And who, besides yourself and the deceased, possessed detailed knowledge of these transactions?" "Our chief clerk, Mr. Pemberton, maintains the primary ledgers, while our accountant, Mr. Silas Crane, prepares the quarterly reports. Both men have been with the firm for over a decade, and I would stake my reputation on their discretion." "Reputations, Mr. Whitmore, are poor currency in murder investigations," Holmes observed dryly. He moved to the desk once more, lifting one of the scorched papers to examine it more closely. "These documents bear the letterhead of your firm. Were they brought here specifically for last night's meeting, or does Ashford habitually conduct business from his home study?" "Reginald rarely worked from home. His presence here with those particular papers suggests he was preparing for someone, likely the visitor he mentioned to me yesterday afternoon." Holmes set down the paper and fixed Whitmore with a steady stare. "You have made no mention of this visitor until now. Describe this conversation in exact detail." Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. It was brief, perhaps 5 minutes at most. Ashford seemed agitated, distracted. He mentioned that someone would be calling on him that evening to discuss the irregularities. Those were his precise words. When I pressed him for details, he merely said it was someone who had discovered certain discrepancies and demanded an explanation. Did he name this individual? No, though his manner suggested it was someone whose opinion he valued or feared. Ashford was not easily intimidated, Mr. Holmes, yet he seemed genuinely troubled by this impending meeting. Holmes began his characteristic pacing, hands clasped behind his back. "So we have a mysterious visitor who possessed knowledge of your firm's financial improprieties, yet who apparently vanished from a locked room after somehow causing your partner's death and arranging an impossible candle to burn with. Mathematical precision." He paused, turning sharply to face us. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, does the name Professor Heinrich Müller mean anything to you?" "I'm afraid not. Should it? Perhaps not directly. Yet his book on combustion mathematics was prominently displayed on Ashford's shelves. A curious reading choice for a financier, unless such knowledge served a specific purpose." Holmes moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded square. "Watson, I believe we must examine Ashford's private chambers. Often a man's bedroom reveals truths his public spaces conceal." As we ascended to the first floor, I could not shake the feeling that we were being drawn deeper into a web of deception far more complex than simple financial fraud. The mathematical candle continued to burn in my imagination, its impossible spiral mocking every natural law I understood, yet serving some purpose that remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Holmes's methodical search of Ashford's bedroom soon revealed another crucial piece of evidence, a leather-bound diary with 3 pages carefully excised from the final week's entries. The precision of their removal spoke of premeditation rather than panic, suggesting someone who understood that Ashford's meticulous nature would have recorded every detail of his final days. "Someone anticipated our investigation, Watson," Holmes murmured, examining the clean cuts with his magnifying lens. "They removed evidence with surgical precision, yet in doing so, they have told us something valuable, that those missing appointments were significant enough to warrant such careful erasure." The candle that wouldn't go out had become more than an impossible phenomenon. It was rapidly revealing itself as the centerpiece of an intricate design that challenged both the laws of physics and the principles of detection itself. The following morning found Holmes in our Baker Street laboratory, surrounded by an array of chemical apparatus and the acrid smell of burning wax samples. He had clearly spent the sleepless hours since our return from Grosvenor Square conducting methodical experiments, his sharp features illuminated by the pale flames of various test candles arranged across the work table like votive offerings to the god of deduction. "The candle yields its secrets reluctantly, Watson," Holmes announced without looking up from his microscope. "Yet yield them it must. Observe this residue, beeswax of the finest quality, but adulterated with metallic salts in precise proportions. Strontium compounds and traces of copper distributed through the wax in calculated layers." I moved closer to examine his findings. "To what purpose would someone introduce metallic elements into a candle?" "To regulate the burn rate with mathematical precision," Holmes replied, lifting a fragment of the original wax with his forceps. "These compounds alter the combustion temperature at specific intervals, creating that spiral pattern we observed. But more significantly, Watson, they establish an exact timepiece, one that could measure predetermined intervals with the accuracy of a chronometer." Before I could respond to this remarkable revelation, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door with evident concern. "Mr. Holmes, there's a gentleman here in considerable distress, a Mr. Silas Crane from the Ashford firm. He insists the matter is urgent and concerns his personal safety." Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "The accountant arrives before we seek him out. Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered our sitting room bore all the hallmarks of his profession. Slight of build, with ink-stained fingers and the nervous demeanor of one accustomed to working with figures rather than facing crises. His face was pale with evident fear, and his hands trembled as he clutched a leather document case. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Crane began without preamble, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believe Mr. Ashford was murdered, and I fear I may be the next victim." He extracted a sheet of paper from his case with shaking hands. "This arrived by post yesterday morning." Holmes examined the threatening message with his magnifying lens. The words, composed of letters cut from various newspapers, formed a chilling warning. "Ashford asked too many questions. You would be wise to ask none. The candle burns for those who seek forbidden knowledge." "Constructed with considerable care," Holmes observed, noting the different typefaces. "Our correspondent reads multiple publications, including the Times financial section. Now, Mr. Crane, what forbidden knowledge did Ashford seek, and what questions warranted such dramatic warnings?" Crane's composure cracked entirely. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Ashford discovered that our financial irregularities were far more extensive than Mr. Whitmore indicated. What appeared to be temporary redirections of £8,000 were actually systematic falsifications spanning 2 years. Someone had created phantom investments in Indian Railway bonds, replacing actual securities with forged certificates. The true scope approaches £15,000. Holmes leaned forward intently. Who besides yourself, Whitmore, and the deceased possessed detailed knowledge of these transactions? Our chief clerk, Pemberton, maintains the primary ledgers, but Ashford had begun consulting external experts about the mathematical patterns he discovered in the falsifications. He mentioned visiting someone at the Royal Society, a Professor Morstan, I believe, seeking assistance with probability calculations and temporal measurements. Temporal measurements, Holmes repeated softly. Most illuminating. Continue. Ashford became obsessed with the precision of the fraud's timing. He said the falsifications occurred at intervals that suggested mathematical planning rather than opportunistic theft. He spent hours calculating burn rates and combustion patterns. I thought he had taken leave of his senses until I learned of that impossible candle. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his profile sharp against the grey morning light. The pattern emerges with crystalline clarity, Watson. We are confronting someone who possesses not merely criminal intent and financial acumen, but sophisticated knowledge of applied mathematics. Someone capable of constructing a precision timepiece from wax and metallic compounds, then employing it to orchestrate murder with scientific exactitude. He turned back to Crane with sudden intensity. This Professor Morstan. Describe Ashford's consultations with him in precise detail. Twice in the week before his death, sir. Ashford returned from these meetings greatly agitated, muttering about mathematical certainties and temporal precision. He said someone at the firm possessed knowledge that made our simple embezzlement appear childish by comparison. The implications settled over our sitting room like the London fog itself. Dense, obscuring, yet gradually revealing shapes that challenged our understanding of both the crime and the criminal mind behind it. Holmes wasted no time in arranging our visit to the Royal Society, dispatching a telegram to Professor Morstan that very morning. The reply arrived within the hour, confirming our appointment for that afternoon. As we prepared to depart Baker Street, I observed that peculiar intensity in Holmes's manner that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions, a coiled energy that suggested his remarkable mind was already several steps ahead of our investigation. The fog had lifted sufficiently by afternoon to reveal the imposing neoclassical facade of Burlington House, though the November chill remained undiminished. Professor Leonard Morstan proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, with the stooped shoulders and penetrating gaze characteristic of one who had devoted his life to unraveling the mathematical mysteries of the natural world. His laboratory presented a fascinating amalgamation of theoretical mathematics and practical chemistry, with blackboards covered in complex equations standing beside benches laden with experimental apparatus. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Professor Morstan greeted us with scholarly courtesy, though concern flickered in his eyes. I confess I've been expecting your visit since reading of poor Ashford's death. A most disturbing business, particularly given our recent consultations regarding temporal mathematics. Holmes settled into the offered chair with characteristic directness. Professor, I understand Ashford consulted you about mathematical patterns in financial transactions. What precisely did he wish to learn? Morstan moved to one of his blackboards, where faded chalk marks outlined a series of intricate calculations. He brought me ledger entries spanning 2 years, requesting analysis of the temporal distribution of certain transactions. Initially, I detected nothing remarkable, merely the random fluctuations of commercial activity. However, when I applied advanced mathematical analysis to the timing patterns, an extraordinary progression emerged. He sketched a waveform with practiced strokes. The fraudulent transactions occurred at intervals, following a logarithmic progression, each succeeding event separated from the previous by a time period that increased according to a precise mathematical formula. This was not opportunistic theft, gentlemen. This was systematic extraction orchestrated by someone with profound understanding of temporal algorithms. Holmes leaned forward with intense interest. The same logarithmic progression we observed in the candle's spiral formation? Precisely identical, Mr. Holmes. When Ashford described that mathematical spiral, I immediately recognized the signature. Someone with advanced knowledge of combustion chemistry was creating timing mechanisms of extraordinary precision. Morstan moved to a side table where various candle samples lay dissected beside measuring instruments. By introducing metallic salts, strontium compounds, traces of copper, into beeswax in calculated layers, one can regulate burn rates with chronometer-like accuracy. Could such knowledge be used to manipulate perceived time? I asked, fascinated despite the grim circumstances. Indeed, Dr. Watson, a candle appearing to have burned for 6 hours might actually consume itself in 2, or conversely, burn far slower than natural laws dictate. The spiral pattern serves as a visual record of this temporal manipulation, proof of the deception for those educated enough to recognize it. Holmes rose abruptly, his eyes blazing with that cold fire of intellectual triumph. Ashford discovered not merely financial fraud, but a method of temporal deception sophisticated enough to provide unassailable alibis. The murderer uses time itself as both weapon and shield. Before Professor Morstan could respond, urgent footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. A laboratory assistant appeared breathless with haste. Professor, Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard requests immediate audience with your visitors. He says the matter is of utmost urgency. Lestrade entered without ceremony, his usually confident manner replaced by evident distress. Holmes, we've another body. Pemberton, the chief clerk, found dead in his lodgings near Clerkenwell. Door locked from within, no signs of violence, but... He reached into his coat and produced a familiar brass candle holder containing the stub of a beeswax candle. Another impossible spiral, identical to Ashford's. Holmes examined the evidence with his magnifying lens. Inferior workmanship compared to the original. Cruder compounds, less precise layering. Our killer grows either confident or careless. There's more, Lestrade continued grimly. We found detailed calculations in Pemberton's possession, equations regarding burn rates and chemical compounds. It appears he understood the candle's true purpose and was attempting to blackmail the murderer with this knowledge. Holmes straightened, his expression hardening with grim determination. The pattern crystallizes with mathematical precision, gentlemen. We face an adversary who eliminates threats with the same systematic approach he applies to financial fraud. Each death accompanied by his temporal signature, a candle that defies natural law while proclaiming intellectual superiority. He turned to me with sudden urgency. Watson, we must return to Baker Street immediately. Tonight, I believe, we'll bring our final confrontation with this master of mathematical murder. The game had evolved from impossible puzzle to deadly reality, with time itself as both the weapon and the battlefield. The evening shadows lengthened across Baker Street as Holmes sat surrounded by an intricate array of chemical apparatus, his gaunt features illuminated by the flickering flames of multiple test candles arranged across our sitting room like votive offerings to the god of temporal deception. He had spent the hours since our return from the Royal Society in fevered experimentation, occasionally muttering calculations under his breath or scribbling equations in his commonplace book with the intensity of a man possessed. "Watson," he announced suddenly, extinguishing several of the test flames with sharp puffs of breath. "We have been approaching this investigation from entirely the wrong direction. We have focused upon the impossibility of the candle when we should have been questioning the necessity of its existence. Why would a murderer capable of killing without leaving physical evidence require such an elaborate temporal signature?" I watched with growing concern as he paced the length of our sitting room, his movement sharp and erratic. There was a feverish quality to his energy that spoke of a mind operating at the very limits of human capacity. His pipe lay cold upon the mantel, abandoned in favor of pure, unadulterated cerebration. "Consider the evidence, my dear fellow," Holmes continued, gesturing toward his experimental setup. "Two men dead in locked rooms, each attended by a mathematically impossible candle. The killer possesses sufficient knowledge to commit perfect murders, yet he insists upon leaving these elaborate signatures. This is not mere vanity. It serves a specific, calculated purpose." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram, her expression grave with concern. Holmes tore it open, his eyes scanning the contents with rapid intensity. "From our friend Crane," he announced. "Another threatening message, more specific this time. The third candle burns tonight for those who cannot remain silent. Mathematical certainty admits no exceptions." Holmes sprang to his feet with characteristic energy, moving to his chemical bench, where he began preparing compounds with practiced efficiency. "The killer grows desperate, Watson. Pemberton's death has failed to silence the investigation, and now Crane represents the final witness to the financial fraud. But more importantly, this message confirms my hypothesis about the true purpose of these temporal devices." "Which is?" I asked, fascinated despite the grim circumstances. "Alibis, Watson. Perfect, unassailable alibis anchored to the perceived passage of time." Holmes held up one of his experimental candles, its wax gleaming with metallic inclusions. "A candle that appears to have burned for 6 hours provides its owner with 6 hours of apparent presence at the scene. Yet if that same candle actually consumes itself in 2 hours through chemical manipulation, our killer gains 4 hours of unaccounted time. 4 hours during which he could travel anywhere in London, commit any crime, and return to establish his presence elsewhere." The implications struck me with the force of revelation. The mathematical spiral serves as proof of the deception, a signature that only someone with advanced knowledge could recognize. Precisely. Our murderer is not merely eliminating witnesses. He is demonstrating intellectual superiority while creating temporal impossibilities that baffle conventional investigation. Holmes moved to his desk and began composing telegrams with swift, decisive strokes. "Tonight, Watson, we shall turn his own weapon against him. I'm inviting all our suspects to witness a demonstration of the method. Whitmore, Crane, and one other whose presence I believe will prove most illuminating." As darkness descended upon London, Holmes transformed our sitting room into an elaborate stage. He positioned mirrors to reflect candlelight from multiple angles, arranged chemical apparatus in precise patterns, and placed his own creation, a candle engineered with the same spiral-inducing compounds, at the center of the display. "The adversary we face is driven by intellectual vanity as much as greed," Holmes observed, making final adjustments to his preparations. "He uses these impossible candles not merely as timing devices, but as signatures of his genius. We must exploit this arrogance." Shortly before midnight, our guests began to arrive. Whitmore appeared haggard and nervous, his earlier composure shattered by the mounting deaths. Crane arrived trembling, clutching his document case as though it were a lifeline. Lestrade, positioned discreetly near the door, watched with professional skepticism tinged by genuine curiosity. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice commanding absolute attention, "we are gathered to witness a demonstration of the method used to murder Reginald Ashford and Mr. Pemberton. Before you stands a replica of the device found at both scenes, a candle engineered to distort the very fabric of time itself." He struck a match and lit the wick. The flame burned with a peculiar blue-white intensity, and as we watched in fascination, the wax began to melt in that distinctive spiral pattern we had observed at the crime scenes. "Observe the rate of consumption," Holmes instructed, his eyes never leaving our guests' faces. The metallic salts, strontium compounds, and traces of copper regulate the burning to create a specific temporal illusion. A candle that appears to have burned for hours has, in reality, consumed itself in mere minutes. The killer uses this distortion to establish false timelines, creating alibis that seem mathematically impossible to challenge. As the spiral formed with hypnotic precision, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Whitmore's nervousness had transformed into something approaching fascination, while Crane watched with the horrified recognition of a man finally understanding the true scope of the deception he had witnessed. But the most remarkable aspect, Holmes continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, is not the temporal manipulation itself, but the sophistication required to calculate the precise chemical ratios needed for each specific deception. This knowledge exists at the intersection of advanced chemistry and practical mathematics, a combination possessed by very few individuals in London. At that moment, a soft knock sounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps echoed on the stairs, followed by a familiar voice declining her offer of assistance. A figure appeared in our doorway, silhouetted against the gas-lit hallway beyond. "Professor Morstan," Holmes said without turning, though his voice carried a note of grim satisfaction. "I wondered if your scientific curiosity would compel you to attend our little demonstration." The mathematician stepped into the light, his scholarly features composed yet watchful. "Your invitation was most intriguing, Mr. Holmes, though I confess myself puzzled by the theatrical nature of your presentation." Holmes smiled that thin, cold smile I had learned to associate with the moment when scattered threads of evidence finally wove themselves into an unbreakable chain of logic. "Then perhaps, Professor, you would care to explain why traces of the unique compounds found in your laboratory were also present in the candles that killed both victims, or why the logarithmic progression governing the financial fraud matches precisely the equations I observed on your own blackboard." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hissing of the burning candle and the barely audible intake of breath from our assembled guests. Professor Morstan's gaze remained fixed on the spiraling flame, and for just an instant I glimpsed something like professional admiration flickering across his features. "Theoretical knowledge is not proof of practical application, Mr. Holmes," the professor replied carefully. "Many individuals possess understanding of combustion chemistry." "Indeed," Holmes agreed, his tone deceptively casual. "Yet few have access to the rare Tibetan beeswax used in the original devices, a material imported by only one supplier in London, whose records show a single purchaser in the past year." The trap was closing with mathematical precision, each piece of evidence falling into place like the calculated spiral of the impossible candle that continued to burn between us, marking time in its own distorted rhythm as the final act of our deadly drama prepared to unfold. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by the soft hissing of the engineered flame and the distant clatter of late carriages in the fog-shrouded street below. Professor Morstan's scholarly composure began to fracture under the weight of Holmes's accusation, his features hardening into an expression that combined intellectual pride with barely suppressed calculation. "Tibetan beeswax," Morstan repeated softly, his voice maintaining its cultured tones despite the evident strain. "A remarkable substance, Mr. Holmes. It possesses unique properties that accept metallic compounds with extraordinary uniformity. I congratulate you on identifying its provenance, yet possession of rare materials hardly constitutes evidence of murder." Holmes moved to his desk with deliberate calm, extracting a sealed envelope from the drawer. "Then perhaps you can explain these correspondence records obtained this afternoon from the Royal Mail. They document a series of letters sent under the name M. Leonard, your own initials reversed, to various members of the Ashford firm over the past 6 months. The postmarks correspond precisely with the dates of fraudulent transactions." Whitmore gasped audibly, his face draining of color. "You are communicating directly with our firm, but why would you?" "Because I was not merely analyzing the mathematical patterns, Mr. Whitmore," Morstan interrupted, his mask of scholarly detachment finally slipping. I was orchestrating them. Your firm's clumsy embezzlement provided perfect cover for sophisticated extraction of capital. The logarithmic progression of my transactions ensured they remained invisible within the chaos of your own crude manipulations. Holmes continued his methodical dismantling of the professor's defenses. Ashford's consultations with you were his fatal mistake. He brought you evidence of the very fraud you had orchestrated, seeking your expertise to unmask the perpetrator. You must have found considerable satisfaction in those meetings, the victim consulting his murderer about the method of his own destruction. Ashford possessed a pedestrian mind, Morstan replied with evident contempt. He saw patterns but lacked the intellectual capacity to recognize their true architect. When he began to suspect someone within his own firm, I realized his investigation would eventually expose my activities through simple elimination. Lestrade moved closer to the door, his hand resting casually near his coat pocket. The inspector's usual bluster had been replaced by professional wariness, recognizing that intellectual brilliance could prove as dangerous as physical violence. Holmes reached into his waistcoat and produced a small piece of blotting paper, its surface bearing faint, reversed impressions of mathematical equations. You removed 3 pages from Ashford's diary, Professor, believing them to contain incriminating evidence. Yet you failed to notice that Ashford, with his accountant's habit of redundancy, had pressed his calculations so firmly that they left impressions on the blotting paper beneath. He held the paper to the gaslight, revealing the ghostly outlines of complex formulas. These are not Ashford's calculations. They are yours, transcribed during your consultations as you guided him toward discovering your own handiwork. He had begun to suspect you, Professor. This blotting paper proves he was building a case against his trusted mathematical advisor. For the first time, Morstan's composure cracked entirely. His eyes darted toward the window, then back to the spiraling candle. Clever, Holmes. Yet you still cannot prove I synthesized the compounds found in those candles. Any competent chemist could replicate such formulas. Perhaps, Holmes agreed, moving closer to our display. But you have made one critical error, Professor. Your intellectual vanity demanded that you leave evidence of your genius. The impossible candles were not merely functional timing devices, but signatures proclaiming your superiority over lesser minds. Holmes gestured toward the burning candle between us. You created temporal impossibilities to suggest supernatural forces at work, hoping to transform simple murder into insoluble mystery. Yet impossibility itself demands explanation. Your elaborate signatures became the very evidence that exposed you. Morstan's hand moved with sudden, desperate speed toward his coat pocket. Lestrade shouted a warning, but the professor was faster, withdrawing a small glass vial containing a viscous liquid that gleamed with metallic iridescence in the candlelight. You think you have solved the equation, Holmes? Morstan hissed, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. But you have forgotten the final variable, human desperation multiplied by chemical knowledge. He hurled the vial not at us, but into the heart of our fireplace. A blinding flash of white-hot light erupted, filling the room with dazzling brilliance and choking smoke. The acrid smell of burning phosphorus filled our nostrils as we stumbled backward, temporarily blinded. Through the chaos, I heard the crash of breaking glass and running footsteps. "The window!" Holmes shouted, his voice cutting through the confusion. "He's making for the street!" As the smoke cleared, we rushed to the shattered window to see a dark figure disappearing into the fog-shrouded labyrinth of London's back streets. The yellow gaslight created ghostly halos in the mist, and within moments, Professor Morstan had vanished as completely as one of his impossible mathematical theorems. Holmes stood at the window, his keen eyes piercing the gloom with frustrated intensity. A mind capable of such calculated evil cannot be allowed to vanish into the London night, he murmured grimly. Yet perhaps this is not defeat, Watson, but merely the conclusion of the first movement in a more complex composition. The spiral candle continued to burn on our table, its mathematical precision now serving as a monument to the deadly intersection of genius and moral corruption, and a reminder that some equations, once set in motion, require more than mere deduction to solve. The pursuit through London's fog-shrouded streets proved as futile as Holmes had anticipated. Yet his demeanor upon our return to Baker Street suggested not defeat, but rather the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed. While Lestrade organized search parties through the labyrinthine alleys surrounding our lodgings, Holmes stood at our shattered window, his keen eyes studying the pattern of glass fragments with the same methodical attention he had devoted to the impossible candles. "Observe the trajectory of the shards, Watson," he murmured, his magnifying lens catching the gaslight. Morstan's escape was not the desperate flight of a cornered man, but a calculated maneuver executed with scientific precision. Note how the glass fell. The pattern indicates he struck the window at its weakest structural point, having undoubtedly studied our building's architecture during his surveillance of our investigation. The following morning brought both revelation and renewed challenge. Mrs. Hudson arrived with our breakfast and a package bearing no return address, wrapped in brown paper and secured with mathematical precision. Inside, we discovered a brass candle holder of extraordinary craftsmanship, containing an unburned candle whose wax bore intricate spiral patterns visible even before ignition. Holmes examined the artifact with intense concentration, his lens revealing details that escaped casual observation. "The wax composition is far more complex than our previous specimens," he announced. "Multiple metallic compounds arranged in precise layers, each calculated to burn at specific intervals. This is not merely a timing device, Watson. It is a communication medium." Attached to the candle's base was a note written in Morstan's precise hand. "To the only mind capable of appreciating temporal artistry. Light this at precisely midnight and receive my final demonstration of mathematical certainty over mere deduction." That evening, Holmes transformed our sitting room into a controlled laboratory, positioning protective screens and ensuring adequate ventilation. As midnight approached, he lit the candle with steady hands, and immediately we perceived its extraordinary nature. The flame burned with shifting intensities, and as the wax melted in its complex spiral pattern, the flame began to flicker in a rhythmic sequence. Long, short, long, short. "Morse code," I breathed, recognizing the pattern from my military service. "The candle is transmitting a message through its combustion rate." Holmes nodded grimly, transcribing the flickering signals as they appeared. The message, when complete, read, "The equation concludes at the source of all calculations. Time locks yield to temporal mastery. Midnight tomorrow brings mathematical certainty." "The source of all calculations," Holmes repeated, his eyes blazing with sudden understanding. "Watson, he refers to the Whitmore and Ashford vault, the repository of all the financial records he has manipulated. The time locks that protect it operate on clockwork mechanisms, precise mechanical calculations of temporal progression." He leapt to his feet with characteristic energy, moving to his chemical apparatus. A man capable of manipulating candle combustion with mathematical precision could theoretically accelerate the thermal expansion of metal components. By applying controlled heat to specific sections of a time-locks mechanism, one could trick the clockwork into advancing hours in mere minutes. The implications struck me with chilling clarity. He intends to rob the vault by manipulating time itself. More than robbery, Watson. Vindication. Morstan cannot simply flee with his stolen funds. His intellectual vanity demands a final demonstration of superiority over both the law and the laws of physics. He will open those time locks through pure scientific methodology, proving that human genius can master even temporal constraints. Holmes spent the remainder of the night in fevered calculation, mapping the precise thermal properties required to affect clockwork mechanisms while consulting railway timetables and street maps with equal intensity. By dawn, his preparations were complete. "The beauty of Morstan's method lies in its mathematical inevitability," he explained as we prepared to depart for Threadneedle Street. "Time locks operate on fixed mechanical principles, expand the right components in the correct sequence, and the mechanism advances regardless of actual elapsed time. Yet this same inevitability constrains him. He must begin the process at a specific hour to achieve the desired result, and that constraint provides us with our opportunity." We arrived at the imposing stone facade of the Whitmore and Ashford offices as the city's clocks struck 11:30. The building stood silent. In the pre-dawn darkness, yet Holmes's trained eye detected subtle signs of intrusion, microscopic metal filings near the service entrance lock, the faint chemical odor of dissolved steel hanging in the still air. "He's already within," Holmes whispered, leading us down the narrow stone steps to the basement level. But his process requires precise timing. The thermal manipulation of time lock components demands sustained, controlled heat application, a process that cannot be rushed without destroying the delicate mechanism entirely. At the corridor's end, we discovered the heavy steel door of the vault, its complex time lock adorned with an extraordinary sight. Multiple candles of varying sizes burned in geometric precision around the mechanism, their flames focused on specific internal components through an ingenious arrangement of small mirrors and metal reflectors. The mathematical beauty of the setup was undeniable, each flame positioned to heat precise sections of the clockwork at calculated intervals. From the shadows beyond the vault antechamber, Professor Morstan's cultured voice echoed with quiet satisfaction. "An elegant solution to an ancient problem, Mr. Holmes. Time, after all, is merely a mechanical construct, and all mechanical constructs yield to sufficient understanding of their fundamental principles." He stepped into the dim circle of candlelight, no longer the distinguished academic we had encountered at the Royal Society, but a figure transformed by intellectual obsession into something far more dangerous. In his hand, he held a heavy revolver with the same casual confidence he had once displayed toward his experimental apparatus. "You arrive at the precise moment I calculated," Morstan continued, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames of his temporal masterpiece. "The final variable in an equation that began with simple financial manipulation and concludes with the ultimate demonstration of scientific supremacy over conventional limitation." Behind him, the great steel door of the vault gave a heavy, metallic groan, the sound of time itself surrendering to human ingenuity and the promise of a confrontation that would test every principle of detection against the dangerous marriage of genius and criminal intent. The candles continued their mathematical dance, marking moments in their own distorted rhythm as the final act of our temporal mystery prepared to unfold in the depths of London's financial heart. The vault door's mechanism emitted a deep, resonant groan as heated metal components expanded according to Morstan's precise calculations, each sound marking the artificial accelerations of time within the clockwork's intricate heart. The professor maintained his position behind the geometric arrangement of burning candles, his revolver steady despite the fevered gleam in his eyes that spoke of a brilliant mind pushed beyond the boundaries of moral constraint. "You observe the elegance of applied thermodynamics, Holmes," Morstan said, his cultured voice carrying that dangerous mixture of pride and desperation I had learned to associate with the criminal genius, cornered yet still confident in his superiority. "These time locks represent the ultimate expression of mechanical certainty. Brass and steel components calibrated to measure temporal passage with mathematical precision. Yet certainty itself becomes vulnerability when one understands the underlying principles." Holmes remained perfectly still, his keen eyes tracking the pattern of flames in their carefully positioned mirrors. Each candle burned with that unnatural spiral formation we had observed at the murder scenes, their focused heat directed toward specific components of the lock mechanism through Morstan's ingenious arrangement of reflective surfaces. "A masterful demonstration of controlled combustion, Professor," Holmes replied with genuine admiration. The metallic compounds you have introduced into the wax, strontium salts and copper traces, regulate the burn rate with chronometer precision. Each flame generates exactly the thermal energy required to expand its designated gear tooth, spring, or ratchet at predetermined intervals. Precisely, Morstan agreed, his eyes never leaving us, even as the vault door continued its mechanical groaning behind him. What appears to be 6 hours of natural clockwork progression occurs in mere minutes through calculated application of heat. Time itself bows to superior understanding of its mechanical representation. The massive steel tumblers clicked with increasing frequency, suggesting the artificial midnight approached. Holmes took a measured step forward, his voice adopting that reasoning tone I'd heard him employ with the most dangerous criminals. Your mathematical brilliance is beyond dispute, Morstan. The temporal manipulation you have achieved represents genuine advancement in applied science. Yet you have transformed elegant theory into murderous practice, killing 2 men whose only crime was threatening to expose your genius to criminal prosecution. They died because they lacked the intellectual capacity to appreciate what they had discovered, Morstan corrected sharply, his scholarly composure cracking to reveal the fanatical obsession beneath. Ashford stumbled upon my work like a child finding a pocket watch, capable of observing its function, but utterly incapable of comprehending its mechanism. The candles were necessary, Holmes. Not merely as timing devices for establishing false alibis, but as signatures of intellectual achievement. Each impossible spiral represented a theorem proved through practical application. Holmes edged closer, his movements appearing merely conversational, yet calculated with the same precision Morstan applied to his thermal equations. Yet your final theorem contains a critical flaw, Professor. You have focused so intently upon the mathematics of expansion that you have neglected an equally important principle, the physics of structural integrity under thermal stress. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Morstan's features. The calculations are perfect. Every variable accounted for, every thermal coefficient. Every coefficient save one, Holmes interrupted, his hand moving with sudden speed toward the nearest candle arrangement. You failed to consider that disrupting your precise heating pattern at the critical moment would create catastrophic thermal shock within the mechanism itself. Holmes seized the brass holder and hurled it directly at the central mirror array. The carefully positioned reflectors shattered in a cascade of glass and twisted metal, instantly dispersing the focused beams of thermal energy. The sudden loss of controlled heat caused the partially expanded components to contract rapidly, triggering a violent mechanical response from within the time lock. Morstan spun toward his ruined apparatus, the revolver wavering as scholarly horror replaced criminal determination. You've destroyed the equilibrium. The differential cooling rates will... His words were drowned by a hideous screech of tortured metal from within the lock mechanism, followed by a series of sharp cracks that spoke of springs and gears failing under impossible stress. The vault door, caught mid-transition between locked and unlocked states, shuddered violently as its internal components warped beyond their design tolerances. In that moment of distraction, I heard the thunder of footsteps on the stone stairs. Lestrade and his constables burst into the antechamber, revolvers drawn, their timing as precise as any of Morstan's mathematical calculations. "Drop your weapon, Professor," Lestrade commanded. "The building is surrounded." Morstan's gaze moved from the disrupted candles to the jammed vault door to the circle of police weapons trained upon him. The revolver trembled in his grip as the full scope of his failure became apparent. The door hung at an impossible angle, its locking mechanism visible through the gap yet hopelessly damaged, neither fully open nor properly sealed. "You have corrupted the experiment," he said in a voice hollow with defeat. "Introduced uncontrolled variables that have invalidated the entire demonstration." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his breathing slightly labored from the confrontation. "I've merely ensured that your method could be properly observed and documented. The partially opened vault provides perfect evidence of thermal manipulation, proof that no natural mechanical failure could possibly produce such precise damage to specific components. The professor's scholarly dignity remained intact, even as Lestrade's men secured him with the handcuffs. As they prepared to lead him away, Morstan turned back to Holmes with an expression that mingled respect with profound regret. "The mathematics were perfect," he murmured. "Every calculation precise, every thermal coefficient accounted for. Yet I failed to solve for the one equation that ultimately matters, that human ingenuity operating within moral constraint will always triumph over genius corrupted by criminal intent." Holmes watched the professor's departure with an expression that combined satisfaction with something approaching melancholy. "A magnificent mind," he observed quietly to me as the footsteps faded up the stone stairs, "perverted by intellectual vanity into believing that understanding natural law placed one above human law." The return to Baker Street. The pale light of dawn was breaking over London as we emerged from the Whitmore and Ashford offices, the city shaking off its nocturnal shroud of fog and criminal activity to resume its honest commercial bustle. The mystery of the impossible candles had been solved through the intersection of scientific knowledge and moral purpose, a reminder that even the most elaborate deceptions must ultimately yield to methodical investigation, guided by unwavering principle. Later, settled in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room, I found myself reflecting on the case's deeper implications, while Holmes prepared his morning pipe with characteristic precision. "I confess myself somewhat troubled by the professor's fate," I ventured, watching the flames dance in our fireplace. "A mind capable of such extraordinary innovation reduced to fraud and murder by intellectual pride." Holmes struck a match and applied it to his tobacco with deliberate care. "The same faculties that enable great discovery also enable great crime, Watson, when divorced from moral restraint." Morstan's candles were merely the outward symbol of his fundamental delusion that because he could manipulate certain appearances of time, he had transcended the consequences that time inevitably delivers to all human actions. He moved to the mantel, where one of his experimental candles stood as a reminder of our recent adventure. The world contains many individuals who mistake cleverness for wisdom, technical knowledge for genuine understanding. Our task as students of human nature is not merely to expose their methods, but to demonstrate that no amount of scientific sophistication can ultimately overcome the simple moral mathematics of justice. "And what equation did this case finally solve?" I asked, genuinely curious about his philosophical conclusions. Holmes's grey eyes met mine, their depths reflecting both the intellectual satisfaction of a puzzle solved and the deeper contentment of justice served. "That human vanity, however brilliantly expressed, will always contain the seeds of its own exposure. Morstan could not resist creating those mathematical signatures, those impossible spirals that proclaimed his genius even as they provided the very evidence that condemned him. The candle that wouldn't go out burned longest in the mind of its creator, and that prolonged illumination ultimately revealed every detail of his crimes." He returned to his chair, settling back with the comfortable authority of a man whose faith in reason had once again been vindicated. "The case also demonstrated something more fundamental, Watson. Time may be manipulated. Appearances may be distorted, and even the laws of physics may be bent to serve criminal purpose. Yet the underlying structure of moral reality remains constant. Truth, like mathematics itself, possesses an elegant inevitability that no amount of clever deception can permanently obscure." As Holmes reached for his violin and began the opening notes of a Bach fugue, I reflected that our latest adventure had provided more than mere intellectual stimulation. It had reaffirmed the essential principle that guided all our investigations, that human reason, properly applied and morally directed, possessed the power to illuminate even the darkest corners of criminal ingenuity. The impossible candles had been extinguished, their mathematical mysteries solved, yet their deeper lesson would burn on in memory. That genius without conscience creates only elaborate monuments to its own inevitable destruction, while the patient application of methodical detection, guided by unwavering moral purpose, remains the most reliable method for separating truth from even the most sophisticated illusion. Outside our window, London continued its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the drama that had unfolded in its financial heart, yet somehow more secure in the knowledge that certain principles, mathematical, moral, and eternal, remained as constant as the turning of the earth itself.